Miss Terry? I saw Miss Terry. Oh, there you are. That was a nifty little profile of you. Was it yesterday, Miss Terry?
Yes.
Miss Terry was featured in Maven's Notebook of the first of 3 inside players.
That's right.
You ought to take a look at it.
She is everything they talk about.
Melinda Terry, I'm the manager for the North Delta Water Agency and the executive director for the Central Valley Flood Control Association, which represents about 75 reclamation districts, including some in the Delta. One of the important things that I didn't really hear mentioned and I've raised throughout being in the process, we've been on the steering committee as well as participated in all the BDCP activities, is the mitigation. As a cooperating agency, we're also a cooperating agency under NEPA with the Bureau for BDCP. We were provided a list of all of the impacts. There's 750 impacts in the BDCP. 48 of those are unavoidable impacts. And the mitigation, that's going to be a lot of cost, but they've just kind of put that cost is just put into whatever the total cost that they've determined for each conservation measure. So there's no amount really identified for this mitigation. And so the concern is kind of related to some of the questions you all were asking, which is, what if that funding's not there? You can be left with clearly a lot more unavoidable impacts if that funding isn't there. And just as an example, during dewatering, which will occur for at least 6 years, for a huge area, lowering the groundwater 10 to 20 feet, homes and businesses in that whole area may not have water or will have to drill down deeper. And so you have an extra energy cost if you are able to drill down deeper, and they pay for drilling down, I hope. But now you have an annual energy cost forever that is much higher than it was before that project came. Or the plan is very clear that there are people in the Delta in that area where the facilities are being built will be forced to abandon their homes because of the ground vibrations and the extreme noise and no water in their homes. And if you're in the footprint, the compensation is very clear under eminent domain. But if you're just harmed in that way, again, are these mitigations going to be there to make sure that those people are compensated? Same for the ag farmers, that loss of groundwater during dewatering. The way they wrote their mitigation is, if we can't provide enough water supply for the current use of that land, we'll just compensate the landowner for not being able to farm anymore. Well, we're talking 9 years. Again, will that funding be there? So that's one of the things I would hope to see as the BDCP moves along, is it really needs to break out mitigation costs when you have 750 impacts, so that there's a separate budget for that and that somebody's already tracking. Now, related to that I brought up is they don't have any governance of the mitigation going on to make sure that there's a group that is ensuring that the mitigation is in fact being done, that it's being done properly, and that it's working. Because if it's not working, then that group should then say, okay, if not this, then we need to go that. I mean, you literally have to adaptive management mitigation as well, but none of that is provided in the BDCP currently. The other thing I would bring up is that it's important to distinguish between what is public I think, a responsibility and what is the contractor's responsibility. A lot of the conservation measures in the BDCP are in fact mitigation for their current operations of the CVP and SWP. They're called biological opinions. Jeopardy findings were made for the existing operation. So CM2, much of CM4, some of the other conservation measures in those 84 habitat projects, those are mitigation. So even if BDCP did not happen, that is the responsibility of the contractors to pay for that portion of those habitat, not the general public. The general public then would pay for all the extra stuff that might be done to try to contribute to recovery beyond the mitigation for the jeopardy findings. And then the other thing I would bring up is there's several issues that weren't analyzed at all in the EIR, EIS, and so those costs are currently not accounted for. So for instance, in the effects analysis, when you read that, and even in the water quality chapter, it talks about all the reduced flows that will happen on the Sacramento, San Joaquin, Feather, and American rivers. And then the effects analysis talks about potential changes in water elevations, but those did not then transfer over into how those impacts will harm current in-delta intakes. So for our ag intakes, if the water elevation goes down, they are now high and dry. At least under our contract, it's the responsibility for DWR to fix and repair that. They didn't analyze it, so therefore those costs are not included. They didn't analyze the annual degradation of the levees that will occur from all the truck traffic. They only analyzed the loss of pavement and the level of service, the number of trucks. And so those costs are not built in. And a lot of the roads that they're using are, in fact, project levees. But even if they're not, that work is not, the funding isn't even identified in there. But in that lowered water elevation, another place where they just didn't transfer it over and analyze it all is on recreation. Again, if you have a lowering of water elevation and less flows, marinas are on the edge. They could literally be dry docked in some places depending on where those elevation changes occur. You also then have more narrow channels for navigation. And during construction, the EIS is very clear that dewatering, they're placing dewatering wells every 50 to 75 feet, and they are pumping 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 4 to 6 years, and then they're discharging back into those waterways. So you're getting a lot of sediment that's added, which again reduces those channels and the recreational type of things. So again, I think there are just quite a few things that I worry, that we're already talking about, can they pay for what's already on the table? And there's just still a lot that needs to be paid for that hasn't been analyzed. And then I think I'll end, at least for now, I saw the Prop 1E funding was mentioned up there, and I was under the understanding that, that Prop 1E funding ends in 2016, that it all has to be allocated and by then. So I don't think that is a future funding source for when you talk about when this project would actually even be able to start. I assume they could currently use some of those funds for maybe some of those 84 projects that were being talked about. But the importance of that is not only does that funding end, but at least for the bond that the legislature had already approved, there's no new levy funding in there. There's no new Prop 1E type of funding for levies. So it's just something to consider that we might hit a drought, if you will, when it comes to funding that's very specific for levy improvements. Oh, I'm sorry, I do have one more thing. Where the facilities will go, where those 2 or 3 districts are, reclamation districts, again, this is like a 9-10 year construction project. It's very clear from the EIR, between the traffic and equipment, you can't compete with that to do any improvements to those levees. I'm not even sure, frankly, that the levee inspections can occur based on some of their descriptions, and flood fighting will be very difficult. So one of the other costs that I think needs to be addressed is that it's likely that those local reclamation districts will need to turn over the maintenance and liability to the state, because they are going to be modifying that area so much that they won't be able to have responsibility for making sure. They won't be able to do any levee improvements on those levees for 10 years during construction. So I think it all, like I said, has to be turned back over to the state, so that they're maintaining that full levee system there. They're responsible for flood fighting and inspections, and if there is failures, because the soils and geology chapter is very clear that they can have sinkholes and subsidence and collapse their facilities because of the dewatering and the pile driving occurring in that area. They are then responsible for liability of floods if and when they happen. Thanks.
Ms. Terry, thank you very much. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it is 8 minutes after noon. My suggestion, a couple of the people had told me they're going to leave and eat off reservation, as it were. I'd suggest we start at 1:20. 1:20. Any objection? Okay, we are in recess till 1:20 today.